You see it in the photograph before you understand it. A man in a bearskin, red tunic soaked with August heat, eyes fixed on a geometry only he can see. Tourists flood past him like water around stone. Some laugh. Some pose. One child reaches up and tugs the hem of his tunic, and the man does not blink, does not breathe differently, does not acknowledge that a small human hand has just made contact with the edge of his world. People call it discipline. They mean it as a compliment, and it is not one. Not really. Discipline implies effort. Implies resistance. What that man is doing is something older and less comfortable to name, something closer to erasure. He has agreed, by contract and by oath, to become architecture. To become the wall. To be looked at and not seen. To be present and absent simultaneously. Most tourists take a selfie and move on. They don't stay long enough to notice what the guard notices. That week in late September, a group of Japanese tourists stopped. They didn't pose. Didn't reach. Didn't make the obvious joke that lands differently depending on which side of the Atlantic you're standing on. They stood at a respectful distance, and they bowed. Not dramatically. Not for a photograph. A quiet, precise, deeply meant inclination of the head, the kind of bow you give to something you understand holds weight, even if you can't fully name what the weight is. The guard didn't move. He never does. But something in that morning shifted quietly, structurally, the way a building shifts in heat without ever appearing to change. Something in the geometry of that courtyard became briefly, inexplicably human. I was the one standing off to the side with my logbook, cataloging routine observations, pretending the whole exchange hadn't pressed directly on something tender in my chest. I wrote nothing in the log about the bow. Some things resist being translated into official language. This is the story of what happened before the bow, during the bow, and, in the long complicated aftermath, when it turned out the tourists had seen something in that guard that the rest of us, in our familiarity, had stopped looking for. And, what the guard, in his magnificent stillness, had seen in them, not the pen. My pen, a blue bic I'd carried in the breast pocket of my duty jacket for 4 months, which chose 7:42 on the 23rd of September to run entirely dry mid-sentence. I was logging the morning handover. I was mid-word perimeter when it quit, leaving a pale gouge across the page where ink should have been. I stared at it. I'm not proud of how long I stared at it. The thing about working palace-adjacent duty, and I use the word adjacent precisely, because I am a ministry liaison observer, not proper household division, a distinction that matters enormously to people who wear the uniform and not at all to people who don't. The thing is, you develop rituals. You log. You note. You record the ordinary in enough detail that the extraordinary, when it arrives, is visible against the baseline. No pen. No baseline. My morning was architecturally unsound before it properly began. I borrowed a pencil from the duty sergeant, who handed it over without looking up, which is how you know a man is a professional. By 8 o'clock I was posted at my observation point on the inner side of the public gate. Not inside the palace. Not outside with the tourists. The exact middle, which is, I have come to understand, the loneliest place in any institution. You belong to neither world. You simply watch the scene between them. The guard was already in position. His name, I knew from the handover sheet, was Corporal Thomas Aldrich Waverley. 26 years old. 3 years in the Grenadier Guards, 14 months on ceremonial rotation at this post specifically. No disciplinary record. A commendation I wasn't fully briefed on. From Derbyshire originally, I mention this only because it explains the faint, almost geological stubbornness of his face, which looked as though it had been carved out of something that had no interest in being rushed. He stood at the east sentry box. The bearskin cap added roughly 18 inches to his height, making him, from a distance, less a person and more an event. The red tunic was immaculate in the way that takes effort to disguise as effortless. White gloves. Black boots that caught the weak September light and held it, like a threat. He faced forward. He would face forward for the next 2 hours without interruption. I know this because I know the rotation. I know what time the relief comes. I know, to within a 40-second margin, when his legs begin their micro-adjustments, the tiny compensatory weight shifts that prevent blood from pooling, that keep a man upright when his body is quietly arguing for the floor. I've logged enough guards over 2 years to read the physical grammar of their endurance. Waverley's grammar was unusual. Most guards shift at roughly the 11-minute mark. A small redistribution of weight from right foot to left, almost invisible at distance, almost imperceptible even close. A recalibration. The body writing a small footnote, still here, still managing, carrying on. Waverley held for 22 minutes before his first adjustment. I made a note of this in my borrowed pencil, which left marks too light and uncertain for a proper log, but would have to do. The tourists arrived at 8:34. They came in a group of 11, which I would confirm later when I went back and counted from the logbook and then confirmed again because I didn't trust my first count. 11 Japanese tourists, range of ages, a woman at the front who appeared to be coordinating the group with the particular purposeful calm of someone who has shepherded people through airports and art museums and is entirely unbothered by anything the universe might produce. They positioned themselves at the barrier. The appropriate distance. They read the signs, I watched them read the signs, actually read them, the way people who respect instructions actually do, and they arranged themselves without crowding, without jostling. They looked at Waverley. I looked at Waverley looking at nothing. This is the thing non-military people struggle to understand about ceremonial guard duty: the guard is not ignoring you. Ignoring requires awareness of the thing being dismissed. What a properly conditioned ceremonial guard has achieved is the genuinely impressive cognitive feat of narrowing his attention field to a specific visual plane roughly 2 meters above and beyond the nearest human being in front of him. He sees. He processes. He does not register. The tourists are weather. The tourists are ambient data. They exist in a register below response. 3 of the 11 tourists produced phones. Standard. 2 of them moved slightly to improve their angles. Standard. The woman at the front, the coordinator, the one who'd read the signs, did neither. She stood with her hands loosely at her sides and she looked at Waverley the way you look at something that requires looking at. Not gawping. Not consuming. Considering. The kind of attention that has weight. I wrote, female tourist, approximately 50s, grey anorak, appears to be studying the guard with specific intentionality. Then, I crossed out intentionality because it sounded like I was editorializing, and I wrote focus instead. Then, I looked up from my pencil and saw something I did not put in the logbook. Waverley's eyes had changed. Not moved. Not shifted. His head was perfectly, professionally still. But eyes, and I have logged enough human beings under stress to have become, against my will, something of an amateur reader of eyes. Eyes can change without moving. The pupil tells you almost nothing. It's the surrounding musculature. The infinitesimal adjustment of the brow. The guard was aware. Not distracted. Not compromised. But, aware in a way that was qualitatively different from his standard baseline, in a way my borrowed pencil was not adequate to describe. The woman in the grey anorak looked at him for perhaps 40 seconds. Then, she inclined her head. A bow. Small. Precise. Not theatrical. Not for the group behind her. For him. He did not move. He did not move. But, his chin, and, I am aware of how this sounds, and, I am putting it in writing anyway, his chin fractionally, almost microscopically, lowered. 1 millimeter. 2. And, then, it stopped. The tourists photographed the gates and the changing of the signage board, and one woman photographed a pigeon with what I could only interpret as genuine delight, and the group moved on, and the morning resumed its ordinary grammar. I stared at my logbook. 8:41, I wrote. Routine tourist group departed post. I put a full stop after it. I put the pencil in my pocket. 14 months at this post, and I had never once seen Corporal Thomas Aldrich Waverley acknowledge another human being during a live duty rotation. Not once. I went back and read through every prior observation log I'd filed. 47 shifts. I checked the timestamps where I'd noted public interaction attempts. Children tugging his tunic. Men trying to provoke a reaction. The full spectrum of things tourists do to walls to see if the walls are real. Nothing. Clean record. I had no framework for the millimeter I had just observed. I added a second sentence to the 841 log entry. Then, I scratched it out. Some things resist being translated into official language. The question was whether this was a thing I'd witnessed or a thing I'd invented, because I was working with a pencil that made everything feel uncertain and provisional. By 9:15 I had almost convinced myself it was the latter. Then, the king's equerry came through the inner gate at a clip that suggested he hadn't come to admire the architecture. The equerry's name was Pemberton. I had met him twice before, both times in the corridors of the inner administrative wing, both times while he was walking in the direction of somewhere important and I was walking in the direction of the photocopier. He had the energy of a man who regarded the photocopier as a personal failure. He came through the inner gate at 9:17 and went directly to the duty sergeant, not to me, which was professionally appropriate but personally irritating in the way that things are irritating when you are standing 2 meters away holding a pencil and clearly present. I couldn't hear them. I could read the sergeant's posture, which shifted from routine mourning to active operational attention in the space of about 4 words. His shoulders didn't rise, that would be visible, that would be readable to the wrong people, but they organized themselves. The precise, compacted way a man's body organizes when someone has handed him a problem. He glanced at me. Then, he glanced at Waverley. Then, he said something back to Pemberton that made Pemberton look, briefly, like a man who had hoped to deliver a message and, instead, found himself in a conversation. I wrote the time in my log. Then, I wrote, Equerry Pemberton present, inner gate, 9:17. Sergeant engaged in dialogue. Nature unclear. I underlined nature unclear without meaning to. The pencil. Pemberton crossed to me eventually, with the bearing of a man who had decided to be gracious about it. You logged the tourist group at 8:34? I did. The Japanese group. 11 individuals. Correct. He looked at my logbook. Then, at my pencil. I watched him register the pencil and file whatever conclusion it suggested under deal with later. The woman who bowed. I waited. Her name is Aiko Murakami. She is the cultural attaché for the Japanese consulate in London. He paused. She was here in a private capacity. Not an official visit. Not on the schedule. She read the signs, I said. She is exceptionally well versed in British ceremonial protocol. Another pause. She lost her son at 23. He was completing a year's placement with the Metropolitan Police. A road incident. 3 years ago. I looked at Waverley. Waverley looked at the middle distance. She visits, Pemberton said, periodically. She doesn't contact the palace. She doesn't request access. She comes and, he stopped. Reformulated. She pays her respects. To the guard? To the institution. A beat. To what it represents. To the men who stand in it. I thought about the bow. 40 seconds of specific attention, and then, a small, precise inclination that was not for the tourists behind her and, not for the camera and, not for any social function I could identify from my position in the middle space between the palace and the pavement. What does she need? I asked. Nothing. That's the point. Pemberton looked faintly uncomfortable, which on his face expressed itself as a microscopic narrowing of the eyes. The king is aware she visits. The king would like her to know, informally, non-officially, with absolutely no documentation trail that would embarrass either the consulate or the palace, that the gesture is received. You need someone to tell her that. I need someone to locate her group's tour itinerary and arrange an accidental proximity in the next, he checked his watch, 40 minutes. You need someone who isn't official palace staff. I need someone who is currently holding a pencil, he said, and therefore has no formal log entry that places them in any capacity they'd have to explain later. I looked at my pencil. My beautiful, terrible, provisional pencil. And, Waverley? I asked. The question surprised him. I watched it land. What about Corporal Waverley? He acknowledged her, I said. During the bow. 2 millimeters. Chin drop. You pulled surveillance? Pemberton was quiet for 3 full seconds. The surveillance review is ongoing, he said. Which meant yes. Which meant I had not invented it. Which meant the wall had moved. I found the tour group at 9:44 at the Victoria Memorial, which is the logical next stop for anyone who has done the gates and wants the full visual grammar of monarchy in stone. They were eating something from paper bags, some kind of pastry, with the particular deliberate pleasure of people who have earned a break. Aiko Murakami was sitting on the memorial steps, slightly apart from the group, with her hands around a cup of something hot. I sat on the step below her. Not next to her. Below. The positioning was deliberate, lower, smaller, less imposing. I am 5'9" but I can arrange myself to suggest 5'6" when the situation calls for it. She looked at me. Ministry liaison, I said. Not official. She waited. The gesture this morning was observed, I said. And received. She was quiet for a moment. The kind of quiet that isn't absence of response, it's the response before the response. The pause where something real is being located. My son, she said, used to say that the guards were lonely. I didn't fill the silence. I told him they weren't lonely. That they had chosen the stillness. He said that was not the same thing as it not being lonely. She looked at her cup. He was 23. He was right about most things. The morning pressed down. The man at the east gate, she said. He has been standing there for longer than the rotation usually allows. I noticed this from the schedule boards. 14 months. Yes. 14 months in one position is not regulation, I think. He requested it, I said. I hadn't known that until I said it. But Pemberton's briefing had included the request form, filed 8 months ago. Continued assignment to East Post, personal grounds. Approved by the commanding officer with no elaboration in the file. I looked at the memorial's stone face. Victoria, in granite, unimpressed by everything. Why? Aiko Murakami asked. I thought about the commendation in his file. The one I hadn't been briefed on fully. I don't know, I said. Which was true, and also not complete, and she was too precise a person not to hear the gap. She nodded slowly. My son used to say, she said, that the bravest thing a person could do was remain somewhere long enough to be changed by it. She stood. Brushed pastry crumbs from her anorak with the matter-of-fact precision of someone who has places to be and is not embarrassed by the ordinary human fact of pastry. Please tell whoever sent you, she said, that I am grateful for the acknowledgement. But I do not require a response. She looked at me directly. I came because some things deserve to be witnessed. Not because I expected anything in return. She rejoined the group. I sat on the memorial steps with my pencil and my logbook and a cup-shaped absence in my hands. Back at the post. 10:45, the relief rotation had come and gone. Waverley was in his second stint, which was unusual. Double rotations happened but were not common. I checked the rotation sheet. He'd volunteered for it. The duty sergeant had noted it with a question mark, which was as close as that sergeant ever came to editorial comment. I stood at my observation point. Waverley stood at the east box. The morning was doing ordinary morning things: pigeons, a bus, the soft London light that never quite commits to sunshine in September. I wrote in my logbook, 10:45. East Post, Corporal Waverley, second rotation. Tourist traffic moderate. Nothing to report. I put the pencil down. Looked at him. He was looking at the specific middle distance that was his professional address. But I thought about what she had said. Remain somewhere long enough to be changed by it. 14 months. 1 post. Voluntary extension, personal grounds. A commendation I hadn't been cleared to read. The wall, I thought, was not a wall. It was a man who had decided to stay. I picked the pencil back up. Wrote one more line. Scratched it out. By 11 o'clock the equerry had sent a follow-up message through the duty sergeant, which the sergeant brought to me folded in two. The commendation, it read. He carried a tourist's child to safety during a medical incident. Last February. Off duty. No press. No record. He asked for no record. I folded it back. Looked at the logbook. Looked at the man in the bearskin who stood as though standing cost him nothing. I thought about the millimeter. The chin, dropping 2 millimeters in response to a bow from a woman who understood, in her bones, the weight of choosing to remain. Not lonely. Or, lonely, and, having decided that was not the thing that mattered. The pencil left marks too light for a proper log. Some impressions, I was beginning to understand, are not meant to be official blue ink, medium nib, belong to the administrative office on the first floor of the liaison building, clipped to a form I had no need to file. I took it. I will not apologize for this. There is a hierarchy of moral offenses, and stealing a pen from a building that contains 17 surplus pens in a drawer ranks somewhere below almost everything else I had done that day. I sat in the duty anteroom and I rewrote my morning log in proper ink. What I produced was accurate and bloodless and said almost nothing. 8:34, public tourist group, 11 individuals, departed 8:41. No incidents. No crowd management required. 9:17, Equerry Pemberton, internal coordination, resolved 9:30. Correct. Compliant. A perfect administrative corpse. I put it in the tray. I sat with the original pencil draft in my hands, which was not a document, technically. A draft. I could have filed it. I could have binned it. I put it in my jacket pocket instead, which is neither of those things and commits me to nothing, and I think about that choice still. The afternoon was quieter. Clouds moved in off the river with that deliberate September methodology, not a storm, just a slow dimming, the sky pulling the saturation out of everything the way a tide pulls back, leaving the day flat and a little cold. I had 3 more hours on post. I spent most of them thinking about the commendation form. Here is what I know about Thomas Aldrich Waverley, assembled from official documents, second-hand reports, and 2 minutes of conversation I will come to shortly. He grew up in Belper, Derbyshire. His father worked for the railway. His mother taught primary school year 3, specifically 7 and 8-year-olds, which is the age where children are old enough to have personalities and young enough to still believe that effort is rewarded. I mention this only because it explains something about the way Waverley moves through the world, which is with the particular expectation that effort is, in fact, eventually rewarded, even when evidence is temporarily ambiguous. He joined the army at 18. Standard trajectory through training. The Guards Regiment, ceremonial rotation, the long accumulation of hours inside a discipline that requires you to perform your own irrelevance in public, daily, without complaint. The incident in February, the one in the commendation, happened on a Saturday. He was off duty. He was, according to the form, buying breakfast. A tourist family, American, 2 adults, a child aged 4, was in the plaza when the child had a febrile seizure. Standard medical emergency. What is not standard is that the father panicked in the specific way that panic collapses useful action, and the mother was crying, and the child was on the cobblestones, and Waverley put his shopping down on a bench and went over and got onto his knees and managed the child's airway and stayed until the ambulance came. He did not give his name to the parents. He went back and got his shopping. The CCTV picked him up. Someone ran the face. The commendation was filed. He was informed of it and asked if he wanted it noted in the regimental record. He said no. His commanding officer noted it anyway, without elaboration, because some things deserve to exist even when the person they concern would prefer they didn't. I am aware of the shape of this information. I am aware of what it suggests about the man standing at the east box in the bearskin, holding his post at 14 months on his own request, acknowledged by a woman who understood remaining at the cost of it. I'm not going to say it plainly. Plainly is not what it deserves. At 1540 the relief rotation came through and Waverley came off post. The transition is brief, precise, militarily specific, a few words, a position handover, the new man steps in. It takes 45 seconds if it's done correctly. It took Waverley's replacement 41 seconds, which I timed out of professional habit and noted in the margin of my rewritten log in my borrowed pen. Waverley walked toward the inner gate. He passed within 4 meters of my position. He was, off post, a completely different architectural event. Still upright, you don't lose that, it lives in the spine, but the formal stillness had redistributed itself into something more portable. He was rubbing the back of his neck with 2 fingers, which is the universal human gesture for a thing that I have been holding has been set down. He glanced at me. I had been staring. Ministry liaison, he said. Not a question. He'd been briefed on my presence at some point, or he'd simply done what professional soldiers do, which is catalog every unfamiliar element in their environment and file it under a working hypothesis. Correct, I said. Good afternoon. He nodded. Started to move past. She comes 3 times a year, I said. He stopped. I hadn't planned to say it. But, there it was, already in the air between us. He was quiet for a moment. Then, I know. 2 words. 14 months at one post, and the answer to why was in those 2 words in a way no official document would ever confirm and no log entry would ever hold correctly. She came 3 times a year. He had been there each time. Not by accident. Does she know? I asked. He looked at me with Derbyshire in his face, that flat, honest, slightly inconvenienced regard that refuses to be elaborate about things that don't require elaboration. She's a cultural attaché, he said. Which was not an answer. Which was completely an answer. He went through the inner gate. I stood in the middle space between the palace and the pavement and looked at the east sentry box, where the new guard had taken his position. Younger face. The bearskin sat at a fractionally different angle, a few millimeters difference in posture, invisible to tourists, readable to anyone who had been watching long enough. The replacement would last 1 rotation. Standard 4 months on, 2 months off. He'd go somewhere else and someone else would come. And, in 14 months, when I reviewed the rotation logs, if I was still here, if this posting lasted, if the pencil and then pen archaeology of my days in this middle space continued, I would look for the name on the voluntary extension request. I didn't know whether I'd find it. I told myself I didn't know. That evening I went home the long way, through St. James's Park, because September parks deserve to be walked through rather than bypassed, and I have enough professional efficiency in my daylight hours to excuse one inefficient evening. The park was doing its theatrical autumn thing, the light going amber and specific, the water holding it, the trees beginning their slow annual argument with green. I thought about the bow. 40 seconds. A gray anorak. A woman who lost her son at 23 and came 3 times a year to stand at a distance and pay her respects to the institution, and the man in it, the man who, she perhaps understood without confirmation and did not require confirmation to act upon, had been there each time. Had chosen to be there. The bravest thing, she had said. Remains somewhere long enough to be changed by it. I thought about the millimeter. 2 millimeters of chin, descending in acknowledgement of a bow that asked for nothing and offered everything. I stopped on the bridge over the lake and looked at the water. There is a particular kind of stillness that most people mistake for emptiness. I had written that nowhere. It was not in my log. It was not in the pencil draft in my pocket. It was just a thing I was thinking, in the inefficient evening, on the wrong route home. The water held the amber light until the light was gone. Then, I walked. I did not think about the equerry's note, folded in my jacket. I did not think about the additional line in his commendation record, the one added 3 weeks after the initial filing, in a different hand, a single sentence I hadn't been supposed to see when the file was passed to me but, which I had seen, and which I had said nothing about. I should have said something. I am still deciding whether that decision holds. The sentence, in that different hand, said only, he asked if the child was all right. He asked twice. He did not leave until he was certain. He did not leave until he was certain. I put my hands in my pockets and I walked through the amber and the dark, and somewhere behind me, at the east sentry box, a new man stood in the bearskin, looking at the middle distance, holding a post he had not chosen, counting the minutes until the relief came. 14 months from now, perhaps someone would choose it. Perhaps no one would. The park did not resolve the question. Neither did I.